We'll go to Ms. Idlout for 2.5 minutes.
Just to follow up with my questions about liberal complacency about pretendians and their impacts on Indigenous peoples and the economic barriers that it creates for Indigenous peoples. I just wanted to ask you to answer briefly why it was so easy for Rachel and for my friend Rachel, who is white, who was adopted by a First Nation, but why is it so complicated for Randy, who has a similar experience but has a lot of people he claims to have made mistakes about his identity?
Look, I think when we talk about each individual, I think their experience and their personal life circumstances may be different. I think you just heard from Mr. McLeod, who offers a very different perspective as well. So I'm not the one impacted here directly. It is Mr. Bossino. He has provided a set of reasons, and I will let that stand. I can tell, and I just want to reiterate, this is a deeply complex issue for anyone, not just Mr. Bossino, but for anyone who is in a very similar circumstances.
Line of questioning. Bill C-15 is implementation of UNDRIP. Whose main responsibility is it to ensure that UNDRIP is implemented in Canada?
It is very much every minister's responsibility. We're all part of ensuring that UNDRIP is implemented. We have 58 measures within the UN under action plan. The lead is Minister of Justice. However, I would say more than a third of those action measures are in the responsibility of the Minister of Crown and Indigenous Relations.
Okay, very quickly, if the TRC calls for action mentions UNDRIP, whose responsibility is it to ensure that the calls to action are being implemented?
Certainly, the calls to action is something that I would that would be led by our department.
Very quickly, then, what have you done to ensure that call to action number 92 on reconciliation and businesses? What have you done to ensure that call to action 92 is implemented?
And that is something that is delegated to Minister Haidu, but we will certainly we do work together on a number of measures around economic reconciliation, including the loan guarantee program, as well as there are a number of roundtables that she has established. We also work with modern treaty organizations as well. But of course, as I indicated earlier, there is a lot more work to do in that front.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Idlout. Next, we're moving to Mr. Genuous for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to talk a bit about the issue of Indigenous identity fraud. Indigenous identity fraud is an act of anti-reconciliation. It shouldn't happen. Minister Anna Ndesangri, you're the minister responsible for reconciliation, so this should be a particular concern to you. Indigenous leaders have said that Indigenous identity fraud is rampant. The AFN has said that substantially more than half of those benefiting from the Indigenous procurement program are actually shell companies. And you alluded a bit to the Indigenous identity fraud issue in your opening comments. The problem is that not a single company has faced consequences for Indigenous identity fraud. There have been zero consequences meted out for an Indigenous identity fraud, despite the fact that Indigenous leaders across the board are saying this is rampant. Do you think it's acceptable that nobody has faced consequences for Indigenous identity fraud?
No.
Okay. So why has nobody faced consequences, and what do you think should be done to change that?
Well, I believe there is a undertaking by Minister Haidu to investigate this matter and to ensure that there is compliance. If there isn't compliance, or if there are those who have lied and who have misled in seeking procurement opportunities, then I think there should be consequences. I'm not the one to determine what that is.
Yeah,
but I do think there should be
and I understand the
consequences.
difference in role here. But you said in your opening comments, and I'll quote you, you said, "We have reports of this strategy being taken advantage of. This is why Indigenous Services Canada is mandated to verify eligibility of businesses receiving contracts under the procurement strategy for Indigenous businesses. These audits led to over 1,100 businesses being removed from the Indigenous Business Directory." So it does seem that you are able to identify businesses that should be removed from the Indigenous Business Directory. And you have companies like the Canadian Healthcare Agency that have been removed from the Indigenous Business Directory. The problem is that once they're removed, there's no further consequences, and they're actually able to bid on other government contracts. So it doesn't seem like you're having trouble identifying the instances where this has happened. The government is simply just choosing not to impose any consequences on them. Case in point, Canadian Healthcare Agency, they're still getting government contracts. They've been taken off the Indigenous business, but they're still getting government contracts. Is that acceptable?
Well, there are three issues here, right? So first is the actual directory itself. So if the directory, is if the individual companies are deemed to be ineligible, first they should be removed from the directory. Secondly, if they did obtain contracts as a result of falsification, then I think there should be consequences in terms of, because it is. Technically, it is a criminal act to lie on a form of that nature, and there should be consequences for those who may have received contract under false pretenses. And thirdly, of course, there should be a bar on those companies from receiving additional contracts from the government for a period of time. We can disagree on what justice looks like. For me, progressive penalties is what I believe in.
I appreciate I'll just jump in because of time. I appreciate your answer insofar as you've actually gone further than other ministers. Minister Duclos, for example, was willing to go in acknowledging that, yes, Indigenous identity fraud is fraud. It's criminal, and where possible, there should be criminal consequences, and certainly people shouldn't be barred from getting contracts. But how do you explain the fact that Global Health Imports, Randy Boissonneau's company, does not appear to have been referred to the RCMP, that Canadian Healthcare Agency is still able to bid on government contracts, that you have 1,100 businesses removed, but nothing referred to the RCMP, nobody thus far barred from accessing government contracts? Doesn't this suggest that Indigenous identity fraud just isn't being taken seriously?
Look, I believe there are measures need to be taken, and I think at the outset I said that we need to do better, and I do believe that there needs to be consequences for those who clearly misidentify themselves, whether deliberately or not, and of course, getting them off the list is the first. First of those consequences.
But you still think Randy Boissonneau should stay in caucus?
Further than that, I think I've already answered that question, Mr. Jennings.
Yeah, it just seems with him that you're leaning a lot into the subjectivity and complexity when he has now admitted that he's not Indigenous, and he's admitted that he misrepresented conversations he's had with an Indigenous researcher in the past. But I do appreciate that you've gone further than your ministerial colleagues, and I hope they will take up your challenge to improve on the significant failures that you've identified, that we've identified in terms of not dealing with Indigenous identity fraud effectively.
Thank you very much, Mr. Genuine.